I think this is the coldest Friday morning of the team season so far. My car said -6. Maybe yours, I heard one said -8 today. Could be even worse next week, but at least we're not wearing shorts today, so that's good. Got a couple of announcements for you as we get started. First of all, just a little bit of Chapel Street Church news. In a couple of weeks, we have an event coming up on a Saturday on February 2nd called Micah 6:8. If you're a part of our church, you know what this is about. But if you're not, you might be interested because this may be something you want to be a part of. Micah 6:8 event is our way of reminding ourselves and others of God's care for the poor, God's priority of justice and mercy in the world, and we want to be a part of that movement. There's actually, I was talking to somebody this morning, there's a wave of kind of humanitarian care going on around the world, even beyond the Christian world, but we want to be part of what God's doing and wants us to be a part of in terms of justice and mercy. So Micah 6:8 is a chance to celebrate that. We have a whole bunch of partners coming in from around the local area who are doing that kind of work, and you'll have a chance to hear from some speakers, and so make that part of your plans. It's Saturday, February 2nd, so 2 Saturdays, a week from tomorrow. So pick one up. There's these little cards out in the lobby. You can pick this up. I'll remind you about it again next week. One more thing before we get started. One of our team guys, actually one of the table leaders from Table 1, he's right over there, Kurt Moranis. Kurt has been part of the team for many, many years, probably ever since it started. But Kurt has had a chance to be gone. He's gone in Florida. Right now. He's going to be there for a couple of weeks all the way through the Super Bowl. Plus, he's a Patriots fan. So I thought we want to give Kurt a greeting this morning. Since he's in Florida, we're here in -6. Let's let him know how we feel. Boo! He's actually live on FaceTime or whatever that is. He'll be listening in with us. We want him to know we love him, and he should invite us all to Florida. All right. Here's our story for today. The CIA had an opening for a special agent. After all the background checks, interviews, and testing were done, there were 3 finalists for the job, 2 men and 1 woman. For the final test, the candidates were taken one by one to a secret location where they were told that the CIA had to know that all agents were willing to use deadly force if commanded to do so. They took the first man to a large metal door, handed them a gun, and said, "When you go through that door, you'll find your wife sitting in a chair. We have information that she is an enemy spy. You must eliminate her." The man says, "You can't be serious. I could never shoot my wife, even if she is a spy." CIA official said, "Well, then you're not the man for the job," and sent him home. Second man was given the same instructions. He took the gun, went into the room. All was quiet for several minutes. Then he came back out with tears in his eyes and said, "I tried, but I just couldn't do it." The official says, "You don't have what it takes. Take your wife and go home." Finally, it was the woman's turn. She was given the same instructions to eliminate her husband because he was a spy. She took the gun, walked into the room. 6 shots rang out. Then there was screaming, crashing, and banging on the walls. After several minutes, there was quiet. The door opened and the woman stepped out, disheveled and wiping sweat from her brow. She said, "This stupid gun was loaded with blanks. I had to beat the traitor to death with a chair. Do I get the job?" The moral of the story is take your wife out for dinner tonight. You never know. Right? The movie clip today I'm going to show you comes from a film that came out last year. And I actually seen it a couple times. It's called Paul, Apostle of Christ, made by Hollywood. And I'm always skeptical about sort of Bible-themed movies made. Sometimes they're a little too cheesy and not made very well. This movie was made pretty well. It's a good movie. It drags a little bit in some places, maybe a little bit long. But I did really enjoy it because I liked seeing something that makes me imagine what the early story of our faith was like. And Paul, to me, is one of the most influential men who ever lived. Specifically, this film is about the very end of his life. He's in prison in Rome, likely waiting his execution. And the story revolves around visits that Luke, the gospel writer Luke, who happened to be a physician as well, was making to his friend Paul, and eventually tells the story of how Luke decided to write the book of Acts, which is in our New Testament, and through these visits where Paul was telling him his story. But the scene you're going to show here, I'm going to show you today, is Luke's first visit to his friend Paul when he hears he's been imprisoned in Rome. And parts of this prison you can still visit in Rome today because this stuff all happened in real history. So this is Luke's visit and he takes a great risk to visit Paul in prison in Rome. So take a look.
Just remember, you only get back out if fight as I did too. You are most certainly a powerful man. I will come back before the night watch ends. Hello, brother. Brother.
Luke. Am I dreaming?
No. I'm here.
Praise God. Praise God.
You have fresh wounds. Can you sit? Come sit.
Yeah. I did not expect to see your face in this life again.
Nor are yours.
Getting in here must have come at a great price. Surely the money could have been put to better use for our brothers and sisters.
Perhaps. But there wasn't a single vote of disagreement amongst the communities. Even the Corinthians gave generously, if you can believe it. Sorry.
I am grateful. I've become an old man inside these walls. Every bone is racked with pain. My eyesight become even weaker.
Quit your complaining. I have new robes, fresh water to bathe. So ye shall be a clean old man. I'm glad to see you kept yourself busy while I was gone. Getting yourself arrested again. Challenging Nero again. And apparently finding the time to burn down half a Rome. Well done, old man. I received the news about your trial at the Forum. I know you stood alone. You know I would have never left your side.
You are here now.
And so I am.
I like that part of the film. It tells more of the story, but we tend to think of guys like Paul and Luke as, Bible guys. They're like superheroes. The truth is they're just flesh and blood men like us. Paul was a man of extraordinary gifts, extraordinary courage, but he needed Luke, his friend, his doctor. And when Paul needed him, Luke came. That's what the story is about. We spent the last 2 weeks talking about the ancient story of Daniel and his 3 friends during the time of the Babylonian captivity, a story of courageous faith in a hostile culture. Took 2 weeks talking about that, but for today and next week, we're looking at a much, much different story, and a much more ancient story, actually, one of the more difficult and important stories of the entire Bible, and that's the story of Job. It deals with the question of undeserved suffering. In fact, it's part of what we're dealing with this weekend at Chapel Street. We're in a series called Explore God. This week we're dealing with the question, why does God allow pain and suffering? It's a difficult and important question. It's right at the center of this story of Job. Let me give you a little background before we read the passage for today. In the very first chapter of this ancient book, we learn that Job was a great man. The Bible says the greatest man in all the East. He was successful, wealthy beyond measure, had a wife, 10 children, and was a righteous man who loved and worshiped his God. And then we're told of a very strange conversation between God and Satan, who was a fallen angel cast out of heaven because of his pride. But in this conversation, Satan basically accuses God of bribing Job to worship him. He says, you take away his wealth, and Job will curse you to your face. God says, okay, you're on. You can take his stuff, but you can't touch Job himself. And the next thing we know, gangs of thieves come in and steal all Job's animals. Lightning strike burns down his barn, and tornado destroys his home and kills all 10 of his children. That happens all in the first chapter. But Job contrary to what Satan believed, does not curse God. He falls on his face in grief and continues to worship God. So Satan tries again. He says, okay, God, touch the man, touch his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to his face. God says, okay, you can touch the man, but you may not take his life. Job breaks out in painful boils all over his body. He winds up sitting in a garbage dump in ashes, scraping his open wounds with shards of pottery. His appearance is so pitiful, his own wife says to him, why don't you just curse God and die? She might have been the same one applying for that CAA job, by the way. And then we move to the second chapter. Here's the story I want to read for you now. The second chapter of Job, these few verses. When Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. First thing I want to point out here is that a friend comes. A friend comes. Let me tell you a story that I really rarely talk about. On the afternoon of July 18th, 1988, so 30 years ago, a couple summers ago, or last summer, I got a phone call from my brother Joe that our youngest brother, John, who was living with him at that time in Charlotte, North Carolina, and 20 years old, college student, had been killed in a traffic accident. I know some of you have received calls like that, and you know it's like being run over by a freight train. You're not prepared for it, no matter how much you think you are. And it hit my wife and myself like that, and when I could finally sort of stand up and start to think, I realized we needed to find a way to get to Charlotte as fast as possible. My wife called the church office to tell them what had happened and that we'd be leaving town for a few days. And before we even had a chance to call the airline and get fully packed, our doorbell rang. My wife answered the door. It was a friend from church, actually a man who sat on the executive council leadership team of our church, who had heard, left his office, drove straight to our house just to be with us in that moment. Didn't say much, but stayed with us. And before he left, he paid for our plane tickets to go to Charlotte, North Carolina. I'll never forget what that simple gesture meant to me and what at that time was, and still is to this day, the most painful day of my life. Now, in this very ancient story, Job's friends do a couple of things that we can learn from. It says they heard about all the troubles, that's putting it lightly, that had come upon him. They set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go sympathize with him and comfort him. Now, this wasn't easy to do. We're talking about the very ancient world. We don't know exactly where these three friends lived, but by implication, as we read the story, they did not live in the same town, and they did not live particularly close to Job. And so they had to leave their families, leave their work, travel at their own expense, which would have been on horseback or camelback or on foot, to travel over days and weeks to meet together and then go visit their friend Job. They went to be with him. This past summer, when we got the call, actually Pastor Jeff got the call that John Harper had had a major stroke. He happened to be in Minneapolis at the time with his wife. Jeff called me, gave me the news, and we talked just momentarily on the phone. And we both agreed that one of us had to go to Minneapolis because of John's situation. And Jeff was off that weekend, so he drove up, left everything, drove that next day 6 hours just to be with Karen while John was in intensive care, not likely to survive, and in which he didn't survive. But Jeff made sure someone was there because he made the trip to be there. That's what the story of Job tells us. So we hear something happens in the life of one of our friends, something terrible, something awful, loss of a child, diagnosis of cancer. So what do? A lot of times we find ourselves thinking, what can I do really? Do I call? Do I email? What do you say? Maybe what you say is going to make things worse. Maybe they don't really want to talk about it. So we can kind of talk ourselves out of doing anything. The truth is we're often uncomfortable with suffering. We're uncomfortable with someone else's pain. And because we're uncomfortable, because we aren't sure what to say, sometimes we end up not doing much of anything. And we sort of avoid someone in deep pain. And think about it, if everyone does that, we leave the person in pain alone. We end up treating them like they're lepers, and they feel like they're lepers. The first thing we learn from Job's friends is that a friend comes. It's never a mistake to go to and be with a friend who's in pain. The second thing we see here is a friend suffers with. A friend suffers with. Years ago, I knew a family in church had their kids in youth ministry, and the wife eventually was diagnosed with a form of cancer, and I didn't see them all the time, and finally got word that she was, I knew that the husband had been taking her around to experimental therapies to Mexico and all sorts of stuff, but she was not doing well, or was toward the end. So I went to their home to make a visit. And as you can imagine, as pastors, we get to walk, we have the privilege of walking into people's lives at some of the worst moments of their lives, hospitals and hospice care and that sort of thing. So I walked in this family's home. I was completely unprepared for her condition. I had no idea how bad it was. This was a woman whose cancer, some form of cancer she had, and it produced tumors all over the exterior of her body. I had never seen that before. I'd seen people dying before, but I'd never seen tumors protruding from her skin, from her body. It was awful, hideous. I wanted to run from the room. It was hard to sit in there and look at her. And while I was sitting there trying to figure out what to say, how to pray, I noticed her husband was just caring for her, talking to her sweetly, and the way he looked at her was as if she was still the woman he fell in love with. He was talking to her, looking at her like she was the most beautiful person in the world. And then I had the thought, I wonder how many of her friends would come and sit with her looking like that. Verse 12 says, when they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Now, Job has gone from being the greatest man in all the East to a man who's lost everything. All his children, all his wealth, and even his physical health. And he's sitting in an ash heap, scraping his sores with broken pottery. Job's friends come to him, and then notice they saw his pain. This is significant. They were willing to see his suffering. Now, if we're uncomfortable with someone's pain and loss, we are even more uncomfortable when sickness or disease has so ravaged a person that we barely recognize them. But it happens sometimes. And when it happened to Job, his friends were willing to see his suffering. They didn't turn away. They didn't hide their faces. They didn't turn right back around, head back up and say, I can't handle this. They stayed, and they joined in his suffering. It says they began to weep aloud, tore their robes, and threw dust in the air, threw dust on their heads. Now that's weeping, tearing of robes, throwing dust in the air are all ancient symbols of grief and pain. That's the way the ancient people showed that they were in pain for someone, that they were grieving. It was their way of saying they were suffering with and for their friend. They're responding to Job's great losses and to his physical appearance and to his pain. In our modern culture, the equivalent might be the way we have a tendency to wear dark or black clothing to a funeral or to a wake. It might be taking food to someone's house when you hear they've suffered a loss. It might be writing a check to a memorial fund to make sure people know that you care. Some of you were part of a whole team of people that went to the Harper's home right here locally over and over again to do work at the house that Karen needed to have done. A way of expressing care and solidarity with someone's grief. These friends demonstrate compassion. Now, it's important to say here that compassion is not feeling sorry for someone. Compassion is suffering with someone, and there's a difference. So a friend comes, a friend suffers with, and then lastly, a friend stays. A friend stays. A number of years ago, a man in our church was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. He was only in his early 50s. And I don't know how much you know about ALS. Have you ever seen it up close? It's probably touched some of your lives, but ALS is a terrible, awful, cruel disease. It slowly but inevitably sucks a person's life away, robs them of the ability to voluntarily control their bodies, their muscles, eventually their ability to speak and swallow, but it leaves their minds totally intact. They're aware of every single thing that's happening to them all the way along the way. It's an awful thing to watch. And during the 18 months or so that it took for ALS to do its work in this man's life, there were a handful of guys from our church who made it their mission to walk with him all the way along that journey. Started by building ramps at his house, up to steps on the back deck, so that when the time came when he was going to be in a wheelchair, which did come, he would be able to get around. They rebuilt his whole bathroom so that when the time came, which did come, that his wife would make his wife easier to care, make it easier for his wife to care for him. And then after doing all that, they just hung out with him, just like a friend. Even to where the place came when he couldn't talk anymore. They stayed with him. It's not easy to watch someone die slowly, but these guys did. Verse 13, then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. This is the part of the story I always notice, part of the story I love. They sat on the ground with him. Now remember, he's gone from the richest man in the East, houses, cattle, all that stuff, to sitting in the ashes of a garbage dump, scraping his wounds. So they sit with him there. So this is like sitting in a hospital room with someone getting chemotherapy. This is like sitting in someone's family room and it's all been reorganized and there's a bed in there and they're in hospice care. They stayed with Job 7 days and 7 nights. Now 7 days was the ancient view of a mourning period, but they sat with them. They came, suffered with them, they stayed, and they were silent. It says they didn't say a word to him because they saw his suffering was great. They seemed to know that their presence meant more than their words. Now, sometimes we feel like we need to say something. Like we need to know what to say when someone's going through something terrible. And sometimes the stuff we say is just not very helpful and sometimes really kind of stupid. I've heard all kinds of stuff. I was at a funeral some time ago, tragic death of a child, and I overheard someone in the line greeting the mother, and another lady said to this mother who lost a child, well, God must have needed another angel in heaven. I wanted to slap that lady. No. First of all, so much wrong about that. When people die, they don't become angels. That's a different thing. And God doesn't need any more. Well, not very helpful. Or we say something like, the Lord will never give you more than you can handle. First of all, it's not in the Bible. Second of all, it's not the point. It doesn't help. Or we don't know what to say, so we avoid altogether. This story gives us a different way. You don't have to know what to say. Just go. Be with. Sit with. Shut up. Just care. That means more than all our words. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give is presence. Our presence. Next week, we'll take on the next part of the story where these 3 friends begin talking. And if you know something about the story, you know they manage to mess things up pretty quickly when they start talking. But that's for next week. Here's the questions I want you to talk about around the table today. Just 2, and I want you to turn them in different ways. First, if you faced a personal tragedy or pain in your life, maybe you already have, who among your friends would be the ones to come to be with you? Who would knock on your door? Or maybe turn it around. If you heard, who among your friends, if you heard something, you would go immediately, drop everything, drive, fly, whatever, to be with them. Do you have friends like that? Who would come? And secondly, do you agree that presence is more powerful than words? And how so? And maybe add to that, does it help you to think about it that way? Have you ever found yourself saying to yourself, well, I don't really know what to say, so I won't do anything? Does it help you to think that presence is more powerful than words? So get some coffee, have these conversations around the table, wrap you up for our prayer time about 10 till.